He didn't pay me to stay. He paid me to leave before he ever had to ask. My name is Logan Price, and for 5 years, I existed as someone else's second chance. Not as partner, not as equal, just a carefully constructed replacement. The kind you don't question as long as it works. The kind you forget isn't real. The first time I met Julian Cross, I was sitting in a bar that smelled like spilled liquor and bad decisions, counting the last $20 I had and deciding whether it was better spent on food or one more drink to make the night disappear faster. He walked in like he didn't belong there, like the place itself had made a mistake letting him through the door. Tailored coat, clean lines, eyes that didn't wander. He saw everything without looking like he was trying. When he sat across from me, I didn't ask why. People like him didn't need reasons. He slid a glass of water toward me instead of alcohol, like he had already decided something about me. "You look like someone who needs a way out," he said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be heard. I didn't trust him, but I didn't walk away either. He placed a contract on the table. No theatrics, no build-up, just numbers and terms. The number alone was enough to make my chest tighten. It wasn't just money, it was a reset. A clean slate I didn't have to earn the hard way. "You'll stay with me," he said. "Follow my schedule. Appear where I need you to appear." I skimmed the page, then looked up. And what exactly am I supposed to be? His gaze held mine, steady, unreadable, convincing. One word. That was all. I should have left right then. But I didn't. "Who?" I asked. There was the smallest pause. Not hesitation, just precision. Tyler Quinn. The name didn't mean anything to me then. It would come to define everything. "And when he comes back?" I asked. Because there's always a catch. Always an ending built into the beginning. Julian didn't blink. "Then this ends. Clean. Final. Like everything about him." I signed anyway. Because sometimes the only difference between a bad decision and a lifeline is timing. The first few months felt like training for a role I didn't audition for. Julian gave me access to everything. Videos, photos, voice recordings. I studied Tyler Quinn like my life depended on it. The way he smiled, slightly uneven, like he didn't care how it looked. The way he spoke, easy, relaxed, like nothing ever really mattered. The way he stood close without crowding, like he understood space without thinking about it. I copied all of it. And Julian watched. Always watching. "Too careful," he would say, stepping closer, adjusting my posture with 2 fingers against my shoulder. "He doesn't think this much." Sometimes he'd reach for my tie, pulling it straight, his knuckles brushing my collarbone for a second longer than necessary, before stepping back like it meant nothing. Again, he'd say, and I would, over and over until the difference disappeared, until I stopped feeling like I was pretending and started reacting without thinking. By the end of the first year, I didn't need corrections. By the second, I didn't need reminders. By the third, people stopped asking questions. By the fourth, they stopped remembering there had ever been someone else. And by the fifth, I stopped remembering who I was before him. It became routine. Morning coffee exactly how he liked it. Black, no sugar, always set down to the right side of his desk. Meetings where I stood close enough to be included, but never close enough to interrupt. Events where his hand would rest lightly at my back. Not holding, not guiding, just there. Consistent. Intentional. Familiar. We never talked about what we were. We didn't need to. There were rules. Lines neither of us crossed. But there were moments that didn't feel like part of any contract. Late nights when the office was quiet and he would loosen his tie, exhale like he'd been holding something in all day, and ask, almost casually, "Did you eat?" Or mornings when his gaze would linger a second too long before he looked away, like he had almost said something and decided against it. Small things. Easy to ignore. Until they weren't. The shift came on a Thursday afternoon. The kind that felt ordinary until it wasn't. I walked into his office with his coffee, placed it down, and reached to fix the cuff of his sleeve out of habit. My fingers paused for half a second when I realized he hadn't moved away. Usually he would. This time he didn't. "I'm flying to Europe tonight," he said. I finished adjusting the cuff, letting my hand drop naturally. Business. No, a beat. Tyler's coming back. There it was. No build-up. No warning. Just the truth, placed between us like it had always been there. I nodded once, controlled, precise. Understood. Julian turned to face me fully then, his eyes sharper than usual, like he was looking for something specific. "Don't read anything into it," he said. "We'll talk when I get back. We'll talk." The kind of phrase that sounds neutral but never is. I gave him the version of myself I knew he expected. Calm. Steady. Unaffected. "Of course," I said. Have a safe flight. He didn't move right away. His gaze lingered, searching, like he was waiting for a crack, a reaction, anything unscripted. I gave him nothing. So he left. The door closed. And for the first time in 5 years, there was no one watching. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then turned and walked out. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Just action. The apartment looked the same as it always had. Clean. Controlled. Every detail exactly where it should be. I moved through it with purpose. The watch he gave me stayed on the dresser. The tailored suits stayed in the closet. The car keys stayed on the table. Everything that belonged to Julian Cross remained untouched. I packed only what I came with. A duffel bag. A few clothes. Nothing that required explanation. When I reached the door, I paused. Just for a second. My hand tightened slightly on the strap before I let it go, adjusted my grip, and opened the door anyway. No looking back. I sat down in the hallway, pulled out my phone, and typed the message. Thank you for the past 5 years. I understand the situation. I've left everything where it belongs. I won't complicate things. I read it once, deleted a word, kept it simple. Then I sent it. No delay. No revision. After that, I removed the SIM card, snapped it clean in half, and dropped it into the nearest trash can. 5 years. Reduced to a message and a clean exit. No confrontation. No scene. No second chances. Because I knew exactly what I was to him. I was never the one he chose. Just the one who fit. Until the real one came back. And this time, I made sure I was already gone before he had the chance to let me go. He should have felt relief when everything returned to the way it was supposed to be. But instead, Julian Cross felt something he couldn't immediately name, and that bothered him more than anything else. The apartment was perfect, immaculate, exactly as it had always been. And yet the moment he stepped inside, something in his chest tightened just slightly, like the air had shifted without permission. He closed the door behind him, the sound soft, controlled, final. For a second, he stood there, unmoving, his gaze sweeping across the room out of habit, noting every detail automatically. Nothing was out of place, nothing missing. And that was the problem. He walked further in, his steps measured, unhurried, but not quite as effortless as they had always been. His phone was already in his hand before he consciously decided to check it. The message was still there. Thank you for the past 5 years. I understand the situation. I've left everything where it belongs. I won't complicate things. Short, clean, controlled. Exactly what he would have expected. Exactly what he had asked for, without ever needing to say it out loud. Julian read it once. Then again, slower, as if there might be something hidden between the lines if he looked hard enough. There wasn't. No hesitation. No attachment. No trace of anything beyond compliance. Logan Price had executed his role flawlessly to the very end. Julian locked his phone and set it down on the table, his fingers resting there a second longer than necessary before he withdrew his hand. Then he moved. The bedroom door was open. Inside, everything was untouched. The suits still aligned in perfect order. The watch still placed exactly where it belonged. No gaps. No disruption. No evidence that anyone had lived there beyond what was expected. Too precise. Too deliberate. Logan hadn't just left. He had removed himself with surgical clarity. Julian's gaze lingered on the empty space near the dresser, where someone had stood every morning without fail, adjusting his tie, correcting the smallest imperfections without being asked. Always silent. Always accurate. Always there. His jaw tightened slightly before he exhaled and turned away. There was nothing to fix. Nothing to correct. Nothing to question. Tyler Quinn arrived that evening. The sound of the car door closing echoed faintly through the quiet street before Tyler stepped forward, his presence filling the space with an ease that didn't ask for permission. Julian, he said, his tone light, familiar, like no time had passed at all. Julian watched him approach, his expression composed, his posture unchanged. Tyler looked almost exactly the same. The same relaxed confidence. The same effortless way of holding space. The same voice Julian had memorized years ago without realizing he ever would. You look good, Tyler added, stopping just short of closing the distance completely. Julian nodded once. You've been well. Not a question. Tyler smiled. I've managed. Something about the way he said it didn't quite land where it should have. Subtle, barely noticeable. Julian didn't respond. He simply turned, gesturing toward the car. We should go. The drive back was quiet in a way that should have felt familiar. Tyler spoke easily, filling the silence without forcing it, talking about Europe, about work, about things that sounded right on the surface. Julian listened, or appeared to. His eyes stayed on the road, his grip steady, his expression neutral. Nothing about him suggested distraction. And yet, every so often, there was a fraction of a second where Tyler's voice seemed to fall just slightly out of sync with what Julian expected to hear. Not wrong, just off. When they arrived, Tyler stepped into the apartment first, pausing as his gaze moved across the space. "You didn't change anything," he said. "There was no need to," Julian replied. Tyler nodded, moving further in, brushing his fingers lightly along the edge of the table like he was reconnecting with something familiar. "Still the same routines?" he asked, already heading toward the kitchen. Julian didn't answer. He watched. The cabinet opened. The cup was taken out. The coffee was prepared. The steps were correct. The order was correct. Everything was correct. Tyler placed the cup in front of him. "There you go." Julian picked it up, took a sip, and paused. It was right. And yet it wasn't. The taste was exactly as it should be. But the timing was slightly off. The placement was slightly off. The moment itself didn't settle the way it used to. He set the cup down. Tyler tilted his head slightly. "Something wrong?" Julian shook his head. "No, a beat. It's fine." But he didn't drink it again. The next morning, Julian stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced precision. The movement was automatic, controlled, refined through years of repetition. Halfway through, his hand stopped. The fabric was slightly uneven. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for him to correct without thinking. And yet his fingers hovered there, suspended for a fraction of a second longer than they should have. Because for 5 years, he had never needed to finish that motion himself. There had always been someone behind him, close enough to reach, quiet enough to remain unnoticed, exact enough to never get it wrong. Julian's hand tightened slightly before he completed the adjustment on his own, smoothing the tie down in one clean motion. When he stepped out, Tyler was already there, leaning casually against the wall, watching with an easy expression. "You've gotten sharper," Tyler said. Julian glanced at him briefly. "People change." Tyler smiled. "Guess they do." As they moved through the apartment, Julian's gaze flicked, just once, toward the kitchen counter. The cup of coffee from the night before still sat there. Cold. Untouched. The day unfolded as expected. Meetings ran smoothly. Decisions were made efficiently. Tyler adapted quickly, slipping into place with a familiarity that should have felt natural. That should have been enough. And yet, in the smallest moments, something didn't align. A response that came too quickly. A pause that came too late. A tone that didn't quite match the memory it was supposed to mirror. No one else would notice. No one else could. But Julian had spent 5 years refining something that Tyler now moved through without effort and without precision. That night, Tyler's voice broke the silence again. "You're quieter than I remember." Julian didn't look at him immediately. "You're different than I remember." Tyler let out a short laugh. "That's what time does." "Maybe." Julian didn't respond. Later, when Tyler stepped away, Julian remained where he was, alone in the same space that had been filled so consistently before. The apartment was still perfect, still controlled, still exactly as it should be. And yet the silence returned. Not empty, not loud, just present, persistent, wrong in a way he couldn't immediately define. His hand moved before his thoughts caught up, reaching for his phone, unlocking it without hesitation. The message was still there, unchanged, final. Logan Price had done everything right, exactly as expected, exactly as required. Julian stared at the screen, his gaze fixed, his expression unreadable. Then, without thinking, his thumb moved. The contact was still saved, the number still there. For a fraction of a second, he hesitated. Then he pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then stopped. Disconnected. No signal, no trace. Julian's jaw tightened just slightly. He lowered the phone, his grip steady but firm. For a moment, he said nothing, did nothing. Then, quietly, almost under his breath, the wrong name slipped out before he could stop it. Logan. The word hung there, unfinished, out of place, impossible to take back. Julian went still, completely still, like even the air around him had paused to register it. Slowly, he closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, his expression returning to its usual controlled state. But something had already shifted. Something he hadn't accounted for. Because for the first time since Tyler Quinn had returned, Julian Cross realized a simple, undeniable truth. Everything was exactly how it was supposed to be, and none of it felt right. He didn't remember deciding to look for him. The decision was already made by the time Julian Cross realized he was standing in his office with Logan Price's name open on a private file that hadn't been accessed in 5 years. The screen glowed quietly in the dim light, a clean profile reduced to numbers, dates, and a contract that had already expired. No current address. No recent activity. No trail. Of course there wasn't. Logan had followed instructions perfectly, even the ones that had never been spoken. Julian's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he tapped a single key, expanding the search parameters beyond the original file. Bank records. Transit logs. Any registered activity tied to the identity Logan had used before entering his life. Nothing immediate surfaced. Too clean. Again, Julian leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze fixed on the screen, his expression unreadable. For 5 years, Logan had existed entirely within Julian's reach, scheduled, placed, accounted for down to the smallest detail. And now nothing. As if he had never been there at all. A soft knock broke the silence. "Come in," Julian said without looking away. His assistant stepped inside, tablet in hand. "Your 10 a.m. is ready." Julian didn't respond immediately. Then, calmly, "Reschedule." A pause. All of them. His assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to register the shift, before nodding. Understood. The door closed quietly behind them. Julian stood, grabbing his coat in one smooth motion, his movements precise but carrying an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. Not urgency. Not impatience. Something else. Intent. The first place he went wasn't strategic. It wasn't logical. It was instinct. The bar. It looked exactly the same. Dim lighting. Worn edges. The kind of place people pass through without leaving anything behind. Julian stepped inside, his presence immediately drawing a few quiet glances that he ignored completely. He walked to the counter, stopping in the exact spot where he had first seen Logan sitting 5 years ago. The bartender approached cautiously. "What can I get you?" Julian's gaze didn't move. "There was someone here," he said. 5 years ago. Sat right there." The bartender frowned slightly, trying to recall something that wasn't meant to be remembered. "We get a lot of people," he said. Julian reached into his coat, placing a folded bill on the counter without looking down. Not flashy, not excessive, just enough. The bartender's expression shifted. "Dark hair?" he asked slowly. "Didn't talk much?" Julian nodded once. "Yeah." The bartender continued, glancing toward the far end of the bar. "He used to come in sometimes. Not recently, though. A beat." He kept to himself. "Of course he did." Julian's gaze lowered slightly, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter. "Did he ever say where he was going?" The bartender shook his head. "No. But I think he mentioned something about needing something steady. Work, maybe. Not useful. Not specific. But enough." Julian straightened, leaving the bill where it was. "If you see him again," he said calmly, "you'll let me know." It wasn't a question. The bartender nodded quickly. "Yeah, of course." Julian didn't wait. He stepped outside, the city air sharper than before, the noise louder, more present. He moved through it without hesitation, pulling out his phone again, already dialing another number. "I need you to run a search," he said the moment the line connected. "No public records. I want everything that doesn't show up on a standard report." A pause as the person on the other end processed the request. "Name?" Julian's gaze stayed forward, his tone even. "Logan Price." Another pause. "That's not going to be easy," the voice replied. Julian's expression didn't change. "It doesn't need to be easy." The line went quiet for a second before the response came back, more focused this time. "I'll start pulling threads." Julian ended the call without another word. Hours passed. Then a day. Then 2. Nothing solid. Just fragments. Temporary job listings. Cash payments. No fixed location. Logan was moving carefully, deliberately, staying just out of reach. On the 3rd day, Julian found himself back in the apartment earlier than usual. Tyler was there, sitting on the couch, flipping through something on his phone. He looked up as Julian entered. "You've been busy," Tyler said lightly. Julian didn't respond. He removed his coat, setting it down with the same controlled motion as always. Tyler studied him for a second, his expression shifting slightly. "Something going on?" Julian's gaze flicked toward him briefly. "Work." Tyler held his gaze a second longer, like he was waiting for more. Then he smiled faintly. "Right." The silence that followed stretched just slightly longer than it should have. Julian turned away first, moving toward the kitchen. The coffee machine sat untouched. Clean. Ready. He stood there for a moment, staring at it, before reaching for a cup. The process was automatic. Measured. Exact. He poured, lifted the cup, took a sip, and stopped. Same taste. Same strength. Same everything. And yet, Julian set the cup down. Unfinished. Again. Behind him, Tyler spoke. You're doing that a lot lately. Julian didn't turn. Doing what? Leaving things half done. The words were light, almost teasing, but they landed harder than intended. Julian's hand stilled for a fraction of a second before he reached for the counter, steadying himself in a way that didn't show on the surface. It's nothing, he said. Tyler watched him, something unreadable passing through his expression. If you say so. Later that night, Julian sat alone in his office, the city lights stretching out in front of him. His phone rested on the desk, silent. Still no update. No confirmation. No location. He leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused for a moment before sharpening again. For 5 years, Logan had followed every instruction without deviation, every expectation, every boundary. He had been predictable, reliable, easy to manage. And now he wasn't. Julian reached for his phone again, pulling up the last call. Disconnected. No signal. No trace. His thumb hovered over the screen, unmoving. Then, slowly, deliberately, he opened a new message. He stared at the blank space for a second longer than necessary. Then typed, "Where are you?" He paused. Deleted it. Too direct. He tried again. "We need to talk." He stopped. Deleted that too. His hand tightened slightly before he set the phone down again, exhaling quietly. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Logan was supposed to be gone. That was the agreement. That was the plan. Clean. Simple. Finished. And yet here. He was searching for something that had already been removed. A soft vibration broke the silence. Julian's gaze snapped to the phone immediately. A message. Not from Logan. From the contact he had called earlier. He picked it up, unlocking it in one smooth motion. Found something. Temporary job. Construction site. Cash pay. Moves locations every few days. I'll send coordinates. Julian didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was already standing, already reaching for his coat, already moving before the next message even came through. Coordinates attached. He glanced at them once. That was enough. Because for the first time in 5 years, Logan Price was no longer exactly where Julian expected him to be. And that was the only thing Julian Cross needed to act. He found him before he was ready to understand why he had been looking in the first place. The construction site was louder than the rest of the city, filled with the steady rhythm of machinery and movement, the kind of place where no one paid attention unless they had to. Julian Cross stepped out of the car, the polished lines of his coat and shoes immediately out of place against the dust and noise, but he didn't hesitate. His gaze moved once, sharp, precise, scanning the area with the same focus he used in boardrooms and negotiations, except this time there was no plan, no structure, just a single objective. Then he saw him. Logan Price stood near the far end of the site, sleeves rolled up, hands marked with faint traces of work, his posture relaxed in a way Julian had never seen before. Not calculated, not restrained, just natural. For a second, Julian didn't move. Not because he wasn't certain, but because something about the image in front of him didn't match the version he had been holding on to. Logan looked the same, and completely different. He wasn't watching for approval, wasn't anticipating correction, wasn't waiting. He was simply there, present, unbothered. It took exactly one step forward for Logan to notice him. The shift was immediate, subtle, but undeniable. Logan straightened slightly, his gaze meeting Julian's without hesitation, without surprise. No tension, no discomfort, just recognition. And then, nothing. No greeting. No acknowledgement beyond that single glance. Julian closed the distance, stopping just within speaking range. The noise around them seemed to dull, not disappearing, but fading enough that every word between them would land clearly. "You left without a word," Julian said. His voice was even, controlled, exactly as it had always been. Logan held his gaze, unshaken. "I sent a message." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That wasn't what I meant." Logan didn't respond immediately. He wiped his hands on a cloth, the movement slow, deliberate, like he was choosing his next action rather than reacting. "Then you should have been clearer," he said calmly. There was no edge in his tone, no challenge, just a simple statement. Julian studied him for a second longer than necessary. Something about the way Logan spoke, direct, unfiltered, felt unfamiliar. Not wrong, just not aligned with what he expected. You were under contract, Julian said. Logan nodded once. Was. A beat. It ended. Simple. Final. No room for interpretation. Julian's gaze sharpened slightly. And that's it. Logan tilted his head just a fraction, like he was considering the question. That's what we agreed to. Julian took a step closer, the space between them narrowing, his presence pressing in without overt force. I didn't tell you to disappear. Logan's expression didn't change. You didn't have to. The words landed cleanly. No accusation. No emotion. Just truth. Julian went still for a fraction of a second, the kind of stillness that came when something didn't go the way it was supposed to. Around them, the noise of the site continued, distant but steady, grounding the moment in something real and unenurable. Come back, Julian said. The words were direct. Uncomplicated. Expected. Logan didn't react immediately. His gaze flicked briefly to the side, toward the structure behind him, then back to Julian. For what? The question wasn't defensive. It wasn't sarcastic. It was genuine. And that made it worse. Julian's expression remained composed, but there was a slight delay before he answered. We need to talk. Logan's lips pressed together. For a brief second before he exhaled quietly. You already did, he said. You just didn't say it out loud. Julian's gaze hardened slightly. That's not what this is. Logan watched him, steady, unyielding in a way Julian had never seen before. Not because he was resisting, but because he wasn't trying to fit anymore. Then what is it? Julian opened his mouth to respond, and stopped. For the first time, there was no immediate answer. No clear directive. No defined outcome. Just a question he hadn't prepared for. The silence stretched, subtle but present. Logan didn't fill it. He simply waited. Not impatient. Not expectant. Just done adjusting. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice lower, more deliberate. You left your position. Logan's brow lifted slightly. That wasn't a position. It was a contract. Another clean correction. Julian's hand tightened slightly at his side before relaxing again. You walked away without notice. Logan nodded. That was the point. The words didn't carry weight. They didn't need to. They were already heavy enough. Julian held his gaze, searching for something. Anything that felt familiar. Something he could recognize, categorize, control. But the version of Logan standing in front of him wasn't reacting the way he should have. Wasn't aligning with expectation. Wasn't his. You don't get to decide when this ends, Julian said quietly. Logan's expression remained calm, but something in his eyes shifted just slightly. Not sharper, not colder, just clearer. That's exactly what I get to decide, he replied. The statement wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was simply true, and that made it impossible to dismiss. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them held, balanced in a way that hadn't existed before. Then Logan stepped back. Not retreating, not avoiding, just creating distance where there had been none. I have work, he said, glancing briefly toward the structure behind him. You should go. Julian didn't move. Not immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on Logan, like he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person and failing. This isn't finished, he said. Logan met his eyes again, steady, grounded. It is for me. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just closure. And then he turned. No pause. No glance back. Just movement forward, away from the version of his life that no longer applied. Julian stood there, unmoving, the noise of the construction site filling the space Logan had just vacated. For the first time in 5 years, something he expected to respond didn't. And for the first time in a very long time, Julian Cross had no control over how the conversation ended. He wasn't supposed to interfere. Julian Cross knew that the moment he saw Logan Price walk away without looking back, but knowing something had never once stopped him from acting when the outcome didn't align with what he expected. By the time Logan reached the edge of the construction site, wiping his hands and stepping back into the rhythm of work that had nothing to do with Julian's world, the decision had already been made. Julian moved. Not rushed. Not careless. Just direct. You're done here, Julian said. His voice cut through the ambient noise cleanly, controlled, but carrying enough authority that the foreman nearby turned instinctively. Logan stopped. Not immediately, but enough to acknowledge the interruption. Slowly, he turned back. His expression didn't change. I don't work for you anymore, Logan said. Calm. Grounded. No hesitation. Julian didn't look at him. Not yet. His attention shifted instead to the foreman, who was already approaching, uncertain but attentive. He's leaving, Julian continued, tone even. Settle whatever you need to settle. The foreman blinked, glancing between them. He's on a short term. Julian reached into his coat, pulling out a card and placing it in the man's hand. That won't be an issue. No raised voice. No force. Just finality. The kind that didn't invite negotiation. Logan watched the exchange, his jaw tightening slightly for the first time. Subtle. But there. You don't get to do that, Logan said, stepping forward now, closing the distance with intention. Julian finally looked at him. I just did. The words landed flat. Not sharp. Not emotional. Just fact. Logan held his gaze, something shifting beneath the surface, something that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not exactly, but resistance. Real resistance. You're crossing a line, Logan said. Julian took a step closer, their space narrowing again, but this time it wasn't the same as before. This time, Logan didn't adjust, didn't yield, didn't move back. They stood there, equal distance, equal presence, neither giving way. You left, Julian replied. Without a conversation, Logan let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite frustration. We had that conversation, he said. You just didn't like how it ended. Julian's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. It's not finished. Logan shook his head once. It is. A beat. Then Julian spoke again, quieter this time, but with more weight. Come back. The same words, but different now. Not a request. Not quite an order. Something in between. Logan stared at him, searching his face like he was trying to understand what had shifted and why. For what? He asked again, slower this time. Julian didn't answer immediately. For the first time, there was a visible delay, a fraction of a second where the response wasn't already prepared. Then, without softening, without dressing it up, he said, because I'm not done with you. The honesty of it, raw, unfiltered, stripped of structure, landed differently than anything else he had said so far. Logan's expression flickered, just for a moment. Surprise. Small. Controlled. But real. That's not a reason, Logan said. Julian stepped closer again. This time, close enough that the distance between them was no longer neutral. You said you wanted a future, Julian continued, his voice lower now, more deliberate. You said you wanted something that lasted. Logan's gaze tightened slightly. That was before. Julian didn't stop. You said you wanted a child. The words hung there, cutting through everything else. Clean. Direct. Logan went still. Not frozen, but grounded in a way that made it clear the impact had landed. Julian held his gaze, unrelenting now. Come back, he said again, quieter, but heavier. We'll make that happen. The construction site noise faded into the background again, not gone, but distant enough that the moment between them became the only thing that mattered. Logan didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened slightly, his gaze dropping for just a fraction of a second before lifting again, locking onto Julian's. There it was. The first real crack. Not weakness, not surrender, but something real. Something he hadn't let show before. You're serious, Logan said. Not a question. Julian didn't look away. I don't say things I don't mean. Another pause. Longer this time. Logan exhaled slowly, like he was recalibrating something internally, something that had shifted faster than he had expected. You're offering that now, he said. After everything? Julian didn't respond to the tone. Didn't defend. Didn't explain. Yes. One word. Enough. Logan let out a quiet breath, something between disbelief and recognition. You really don't like losing control, do you? Julian's gaze didn't waver. This isn't about control. Logan held his eyes for another second, like he was measuring that statement against everything he already knew, and finding it incomplete. Then he nodded, once. Slow. Deliberate. Fine, Logan said. The word landed heavier than it should have. Julian didn't react outwardly, but something in his posture shifted, barely noticeable, just enough to register the change. Logan took a step closer, closing the distance himself this time. I'll come back, he continued, voice steady, grounded, but no longer detached. But don't change your mind. The words weren't defensive. They weren't uncertain. They were a boundary, a condition, clear, direct. Julian met his gaze without hesitation. I won't. Logan studied him for one last second, like he was committing something to memory, something he would hold him accountable for later. Then he turned slightly, glancing back at the site, at the version of his life he had built in just a few days, and was now walking away from again. When he looked back at Julian, there was no hesitation left. Then we're done here, Logan said. Julian nodded once. We are. And this time, when they walked away, they did it in the same direction. The first thing Logan noticed when he stepped back into the house wasn't the space. It was the silence, the kind that carried memory in it, the kind that hadn't changed at all, even when everything else had. The doors opened the same way, the floors reflected light the same way, the staff stood in the same positions they always had. But the moment Logan crossed the threshold, something shifted, not in the house, but in how the house responded to him. It wasn't subtle. The head housekeeper was the first to notice, her posture straightening just slightly before she inclined her head, not as a greeting to a guest, but as acknowledgement to someone who belonged there. Logan paused for half a second, catching it, processing it, before continuing inside. Behind him, Julian Cross stepped in without breaking stride, removing his coat with the same composed precision as always, handing it off without looking. "From today," Julian said, his voice even, carrying just enough weight to settle across the room, "Logan stays." No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement. But it was enough. The shift became immediate, tangible. The staff adjusted, not dramatically, not openly, but in the way they moved, the way they acknowledged Logan now. It was clear, the terms had changed. Logan glanced sideways at Julian, a faint crease forming between his brows. "You didn't have to announce it like that," he said quietly. Julian didn't look at him. "They need to understand," he replied. Logan held his gaze for a second longer than necessary before letting it go, exhaling softly as he stepped further into the space he had once occupied like a visitor, and was now being placed into as something else entirely. It didn't take long for the change to ripple outward. By evening, it wasn't just the staff who knew. A single post appeared online, clean, minimal, unmistakable. No caption beyond a name. Logan Price. Tagged. Standing beside Julian in a photo that wasn't overly intimate, wasn't staged, but carried a clarity that didn't need explanation. The response was immediate. Messages. Reactions. Speculation. Confirmation. Julian ignored all of it. Logan didn't. He stared at the post for a few seconds longer than necessary, his thumb hovering over the screen before he locked it and set it aside. "You really did that," he said. Julian, seated across from him, didn't look up from what he was reading. "You said you wanted something official." Logan let out a quiet breath, something between disbelief and reluctant acceptance. "That's not exactly what I meant." Julian turned a page calmly. "It is now." There was no arrogance in the tone, no challenge, just certainty. And somehow, that made it harder to argue with. The next few days settled into a rhythm that was anything but calm. Logan adapted quickly, too quickly, maybe. He moved through the house without hesitation, spoke to the staff without distance, treated them with a level of ease that hadn't existed before. Not above them, not below them, just present. It didn't go unnoticed. The house responded to it, subtly at first, then more openly. A quiet respect, a natural alignment. Logan didn't push for it. He didn't need to. But what he did push for, relentlessly, was something else entirely. Julian noticed it on the second day. The shift wasn't obvious at first. Just small changes. Logan staying closer, timing his movements, watching Julian with a level of focus that felt intentional. It escalated quickly, too quickly. "You're doing too much," Julian said one evening, his tone calm, but edged with something sharper beneath. Logan didn't look up from where he was standing behind him, hands resting lightly on Julian's shoulders, pressing just enough to ease the tension there. "I'm being efficient," Logan replied easily. Julian's hands stilled on the glass in front of him. "That's not what this is." Logan leaned slightly closer, his voice still light, still controlled. "You said we'd make it happen." A pause. Julian set the glass down slowly, turning just enough to look at him, his gaze steady, assessing. "That doesn't mean you push yourself past the point of reason." Logan met his eyes, unbothered, but there was a flicker there, something driven, something focused in a way that wasn't entirely casual. "It means I'm serious." The words landed cleanly. No humor, no deflection, just intent. Julian held his gaze for a second longer, then reached up, catching Logan's wrist, not forcefully, just enough to stop him. "You're not treating this like a decision," Julian said quietly. "You're treating it like a target." Logan tilted his head slightly, considering that. Then, without pulling away, he smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." The honesty of it should have been irritating, and it was. Slightly. Enough. Julian released his wrist, leaning back, his expression tightening just a fraction. "You're going to burn yourself out," he said. Logan straightened, unfazed. Then I'll adjust. Julian watched him for a moment, something unreadable passing through his gaze before he looked away again. You always think you can handle more than you should. Logan didn't respond immediately. Then, casually, that didn't seem to bother you before. The room went quiet for a fraction of a second. Julian's gaze snapped back to him, sharper now. That was different. Logan held his eyes, the faintest hint of challenge surfacing now. Was it? The tension built, subtle but real. And then, just as quickly as it rose, Logan shifted. The edge disappeared. The challenge softened. He stepped closer again, hands returning to Julian's shoulders, lighter this time, slower, deliberate. Relax, Logan said, his tone easing, almost teasing now. You're overthinking it. Julian's expression didn't change, but the tension didn't escalate either. Logan leaned slightly, just enough to catch his attention fully, his expression shifting into something softer, almost disarming. I know what I'm doing, he added, quieter this time. And just like that, the moment diffused. Not resolved. Not settled. Just redirected. Julian exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing despite himself. You're impossible, he said. Logan's smile widened just slightly. You knew that already. Julian didn't argue. He didn't need to. Because the truth was, for all the control he had regained, for all the structure he had reestablished, there was one thing he still hadn't figured out. How Logan could push him right to the edge of irritation, and then pull him back before it ever turned into something else. And Logan knew it. Perfectly. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in small disruptions, the kind that didn't announce themselves, but lingered just long enough to be noticed. Logan felt it before he understood it. A slight delay in Julian's responses. A glance that lasted half a second longer than necessary. Nothing obvious. Nothing that could be called out. But enough. It started with a message. Not to Logan. Julian stood by the window, phone in hand, the city stretching out beneath him in clean lines of light and structure, his expression unreadable as always. Logan didn't ask. He didn't need to. The name on the screen was enough. Tyler Quinn. It wasn't unfamiliar. It just wasn't relevant, until now. He's back, Julian said after a moment, not turning around. Logan leaned against the edge of the desk, arms loosely crossed, his tone light. That obvious? Julian slipped the phone into his pocket. He asked to meet. A beat. I said yes. Logan nodded once, casual on the surface. Of course you did. There was no accusation in the words. No tension, just acknowledgement. But when Julian turned slightly, his gaze brushing past Logan for a fraction of a second too long, something quiet settled into the space between them. The meeting happened the next afternoon. Not in a crowded place. Not somewhere public enough to attract attention. Just a quiet, controlled environment where nothing needed to be explained. Tyler Quinn hadn't changed much. That was the first thing Julian noticed. The same posture. The same ease. The same way of speaking that made everything sound softer than it actually was. But there was something else now. Something measured, something deliberate beneath the surface. It's been a while, Tyler said, offering a faint smile as he sat across from Julian. Julian nodded once. 5 years. Tyler let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. You always keep track. Julian didn't respond to that. He didn't need to. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It never had been between them. That was part of what made it complicated. Tyler leaned back slightly, studying him for a moment before speaking again. I didn't think you'd agree to meet. Julian's gaze remained steady. You asked. Tyler's smile shifted, just slightly. Softer. Warmer. Yeah, he said. I guess I did. There was a pause. Not forced. Just waiting. Then Tyler continued, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. I got married. Julian's expression didn't change. I heard. Tyler nodded, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again. I thought it was the right thing to do, he said. At the time. Julian didn't interrupt. Tyler exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the table before stilling. I spent 5 years trying to make it work, he continued. Being responsible. Doing what I was supposed to do. His voice didn't break. It didn't need to. The weight was already there. But it never felt right. Julian's gaze sharpened slightly, not in reaction, but in attention. Tyler met his eyes again, holding them this time, not looking away. And the longer it went on, he said, the more I realized something was missing. A beat. Or someone. The words settled quietly between them. No drama. No intensity. Just implication. Tyler didn't rush it. He didn't push. He let the silence do what it always had between them. Fill in the spaces that didn't need to be spoken out loud. I thought you were just constant, Tyler added after a moment. Like something that would always be there, no matter what. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. I didn't question it. Julian's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle stillness in the way he held himself now, like he was choosing not to interrupt, not to redirect. Then I left, Tyler continued. And for the first time, it wasn't there anymore. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to shift the energy, not enough to pressure. That's when I realized I got it wrong. The statement was simple, clear, controlled, and that made it land harder than anything dramatic would have. Julian held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then spoke, his tone even. He didn't look away. He didn't shift. He just held the moment where it was. Then, calmly, he said, "A lot changes in 5 years." Tyler watched him, searching his face, trying to read something beneath the surface. "Not everything," he replied quietly. It looked like he understood, like he respected the boundary that had been set, but not far enough to disappear from it. It was deliberate, careful, the kind of distance that wasn't distance at all, just a different angle of approach. He didn't call Julian every day. He didn't show up uninvited. But he stayed present. Invitations that felt casual, messages that didn't demand a response, appearances that could always be explained as coincidence. It was subtle, controlled, and because of that, it was harder to reject without making it something bigger than it was. Julian noticed. Of course he did. He always did. But he didn't shut it down either. Not directly. Not harshly. Because Tyler wasn't crossing a line. Not in a way that could be clearly defined. He was just there. And that had once been enough. It wasn't now. Logan saw it from a different angle. Not the messages. Not the conversations. But the pattern. The timing. The way Tyler positioned himself just close enough to be relevant without ever forcing himself into the center. It wasn't aggressive. It was calculated. And Logan understood exactly what it was. "He's patient," Logan said one evening, leaning against the counter, watching Julian scroll through something on his phone. Julian didn't look up. "He's consistent," he replied. Logan tilted his head slightly. "That's not the same thing." Julian's thumb paused for a fraction of a second before continuing. "It used to be." Logan studied him for a moment, then let it go, pushing off the counter and stepping closer, his presence filling the space without asking for permission. "And now?" he asked quietly. Julian didn't answer immediately. He set the phone down instead, turning just enough to meet Logan's gaze. "Now I don't mistake familiarity for meaning," he said. The words landed cleanly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Logan held his eyes for a second longer than necessary, then nodded once, satisfied. But Tyler didn't stop. He adjusted. He softened his approach, made it easier to accept his presence. He didn't challenge Logan directly, didn't compete openly. Instead, he leaned into what he had always been, someone easy to be around, someone who didn't demand anything, someone who understood Julian in ways that didn't need to be explained. It might have worked once. It didn't now. The difference was small, almost imperceptible at first. A comment that lingered too long. A look that carried a little too much intention. A familiarity that edged just past comfortable. Julian felt it. And for the first time, instead of finding it grounding, he found it off. "You didn't used to say things like that," Julian said one afternoon, his tone neutral but edged with something sharper beneath. Tyler smiled lightly, unbothered. "People change." Julian held his gaze for a moment, then replied, "They do." But the way he said it made it clear, he didn't think that was always a good thing. Logan didn't interfere. Not openly. He didn't need to. Because every time Tyler stepped closer, every time he tried to re-establish something that used to feel natural, Julian didn't move toward him. He stayed where he was. Or, more often, he shifted, subtly, almost unconsciously, toward Logan instead. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't intentional. But it was consistent. And Tyler noticed. Of course he did. The tension didn't explode. It didn't need to. It built slowly, in small moments, in quiet exchanges, in the space between what was said and what was avoided. Until it all settled into one evening. A gathering. Nothing formal. Just a small group of familiar faces. A reason to celebrate Tyler's return. An excuse to bring everything into the same space and see what would happen. Julian wasn't planning to stay long. He rarely did. But the conversation flowed easily. The drinks came without effort. And for once, he didn't keep track of how much he was having. Logan wasn't there. He had work. Or at least, that's what Julian had told himself when he decided not to ask him to come. Tyler stayed close. Not too close. Just enough to be present, to guide the conversation, to keep things light, to make it easy for Julian to stay. It worked. For a while. Until it didn't. The shift was subtle. A slight delay in Julian's responses. A pause that lasted just a little too long. Tyler noticed immediately. "You've had enough," he said quietly, his tone calm, almost gentle. Julian didn't argue. He didn't confirm it either. He just exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with more care than necessary. "I'm fine," he said, but he didn't sound like it. Tyler stood, already reaching for his jacket. "I'll take you home." The offer was natural. Expected. Logical. 5 years ago, Julian would have accepted without thinking. This time, he didn't move. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for anything. He just sat there for a second longer than necessary, his gaze unfocused, like he was sorting through something that didn't line up the way it should. Then, without looking at Tyler, he reached for his phone. The room didn't quiet. The conversation didn't stop. But something shifted anyway. Tyler watched him, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpened. "You don't need to call anyone," he said lightly. Julian didn't respond. He didn't look up. He just waited. And then, Logan arrived. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just precise. The door opened, and he stepped in like he belonged there, like the space adjusted around him instead of the other way around. Conversation slowed. Not because of who he was, but because of how he moved. Controlled. Certain. Unquestioned. His gaze found Julian immediately. No hesitation. No scanning. Just direct. Julian didn't smile. He didn't call out. He didn't need to. Logan crossed the room without breaking stride, stopping just within reach, his presence grounding the space in a way that didn't require explanation. "You're done," Logan said quietly. Not to the room. Not to Tyler. Just to Julian. Julian looked up at him, his expression unreadable for a fraction of a second before something in it settled. "Yeah," he said. Simple. Certain. Logan reached for his coat, draping it over Julian's shoulders with a practiced ease that spoke of familiarity, not display. But the message was clear anyway. Tyler watched the exchange, his posture still relaxed, his expression still composed. But there was a flicker there, small, controlled, but real. "I was going to take him," Tyler said, his tone even. Logan didn't look at him immediately. He adjusted the collar of Julian's coat first, his focus entirely on him, his movements. Unhurried. Then, finally, he glanced over, his gaze calm, steady, not confrontational. "You don't need to," Logan replied. No edge. No challenge. Just certainty. Tyler held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then smiled faintly. Right. The word was light, but it didn't carry agreement. Julian stood slowly, steadying himself without needing assistance, though Logan stayed close enough that it didn't need to be offered. He didn't look at Tyler. Not when he stood. Not when he adjusted his coat. Not when he turned toward the door. The choice had already been made, and it didn't need to be explained. Logan placed a hand lightly at Julian's back as they walked out, not guiding, not forcing, just there, present, certain. And when the door closed behind them, the room didn't erupt. It didn't react. It just shifted, quietly, irreversibly. And for the first time since he had come back, Tyler Quinn understood exactly where he stood, and exactly how far away that position now was. The car door closed with a soft, muted sound that sealed the night outside, cutting off the noise, the voices, the lingering presence of people who no longer mattered. Inside, it was quiet, controlled, familiar. Logan adjusted his grip on the steering wheel as the engine settled into a smooth hum, the city lights sliding past in clean streaks across the windshield. Julian leaned back in the passenger seat, head tilted slightly against the rest, eyes half-lidded but not unfocused. Not really drunk. Just done. "You got there fast," Julian said after a moment, his voice low, carrying a trace of something lighter than usual. Logan didn't look at him immediately. Traffic was clear. Julian let out a soft breath, the corner of his lips lifting just slightly. "Don't tell me you were already nearby," he said. Waiting. Logan's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel before relaxing again. "About an hour," he said. Julian turned his head slightly, studying him now, more awake than he had been a moment ago. "An hour," he repeated. "Why?" Logan's gaze stayed forward, steady, but there was a quiet honesty in his tone when he answered. "I didn't like where you were." A pause. Then, more direct, "And I don't like who you were with." Julian watched him for a second longer, something unreadable passing through his expression before he spoke again, softer this time. You thought I'd go with him. Logan didn't deny it. I thought he'd try. The honesty landed cleanly. Julian let out a quiet breath, shifting slightly in his seat. So you stayed. Logan nodded once. Yeah. Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't empty. It held something. Something quieter, something that didn't need to be filled immediately. Then Julian spoke, his tone shifting just enough to carry something sharper beneath it. You were worried you'd lose? Logan glanced at him briefly this time, his expression calm, but his answer immediate. Of course. No hesitation. No deflection. Just truth. Julian's gaze lingered on him for a second before he leaned back again, his lips curving faintly. You don't have to be, he said. Logan didn't respond right away. He waited. Julian tilted his head slightly, his voice steady now, clearer. Back then, when Tyler got married, he said, I told myself I'd find someone better. A beat. Someone who wouldn't make me feel like an option. Logan's grip on the wheel tightened just slightly, barely noticeable. Julian's eyes shifted toward him again, sharper now. I did, he said simply. The words were light, but they didn't feel light. Logan didn't look at him this time, but the corner of his mouth lifted just a fraction. Did you, he asked. Julian's gaze lingered, a hint of challenge flickering through it now. Guess. Logan let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and something softer. You're not subtle, he said. Julian's smile widened just slightly before fading again as he shifted, his tone changing. Why did you think I drank that much? Logan's expression shifted, his attention sharpening immediately. You didn't. Julian shook his head once. Not really. He paused, then added, quieter. It just didn't feel right there. Logan glanced at him again, this time longer. What do you mean? Julian exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting forward now. The scent, he said. It was off. A small pause. Too much. Too mixed. Logan didn't interrupt. Julian's fingers tapped lightly against his arm, thoughtful. I couldn't stay focused, he continued. So I stopped trying. A beat. Then, almost casually, easier to leave if I looked like I had a reason. Logan's gaze stayed on the road, but something in his posture shifted, more alert now, more aware. You should have told me, he said quietly. Julian let out a soft breath. I am now. Silence settled again, but this time it carried something else, something quieter, deeper, something that didn't need to be named yet to be understood. By the time they reached the house, the night had settled fully around them, the lights inside already on, warm and steady. Logan stepped out first, moving around the car without hesitation, opening the door before Julian had a chance to reach for it. Julian didn't comment. He didn't need to. He stepped out, steady, composed, as if the version of him from earlier had already been left behind somewhere between the drive and the silence. The door opened before they reached it. The head housekeeper stood there, her expression calm but her eyes sharp, taking in the details in a single glance. Welcome back, she said smoothly. Logan nodded once in acknowledgement, his tone easy, familiar. Long night. She allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. I can see that. Julian stepped inside without pause, but Logan followed just a step behind, close enough to be noticed, close enough to be expected. The shift was subtle, but it was there. The way the staff moved, the way they looked at Logan, not as a guest, not as someone temporary, but as someone whose presence had weight now. And Logan responded to it naturally, without hesitation, without distance. You should rest, the housekeeper said to Julian, her tone softening slightly. Logan glanced at her, then back at Julian. He will, he said. Not an order, not a correction, just a certainty. Julian shot him a brief look, something between annoyance and something else, something softer that he didn't acknowledge. You're starting to sound like you run the place, he said. Logan's expression didn't change. I manage what matters. The words were light, but they landed. A faint sound of amusement came from one of the staff nearby, quickly suppressed, but not entirely unnoticed. Julian exhaled softly, shaking his head once before turning toward the stairs. Logan followed, unhurried, his presence steady at his side. Halfway up, Julian slowed slightly, glancing at him. You're too comfortable here, he said. Logan met his gaze without hesitation. You let me be. A pause. Then, quieter. That's the difference. Julian held his eyes for a second longer, then looked away, continuing up the stairs without another word. Behind them, the house settled back into its quiet rhythm, but the atmosphere had shifted, lighter, warmer, threaded with something that hadn't been there before. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something temporary. It felt like something that had already taken root, steady and certain, whether either of them chose to say it out loud or not. The first sign didn't feel like anything significant, just a slight discomfort that lingered longer than it should have, a faint unease that Julian tried to ignore as he stood by the sink, one hand braced against the counter, his reflection sharper than usual in the morning light. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, but the sensation didn't pass. It built, subtle, then sudden. He turned just in time, gripping the edge of the counter as his stomach twisted, the wave hitting harder than expected. By the time Logan found him, Julian was already rinsing his mouth, his expression tight, controlled, but not entirely unaffected. "What happened?" Logan asked, stepping closer immediately, his voice low but edged with concern. Julian shook his head once, reaching for a towel. "Nothing. Probably something I ate." Logan didn't look convinced. His gaze lingered, assessing, but he didn't push. "Not yet. You've been off for days," he said instead. Julian didn't respond to that. He moved past him, brushing it off with the same quiet dismissal he used for anything that didn't fit neatly into his plans. But it didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. By the third morning, Logan didn't wait for an explanation. "I'm calling a doctor," he said, already reaching for his phone. Julian frowned slightly, irritation flickering across his expression. "It's not necessary." Logan didn't look up. "It is." The appointment was quick, efficient, discreet. The doctor arrived within the hour, calm, professional, asking the kind of questions Julian answered with minimal patience, but enough accuracy to matter. Logan stayed nearby, silent but present, his attention fixed entirely on Julian in a way that didn't waver once. The results didn't take long. The room settled into a brief, quiet pause as the doctor looked up, offering a small, composed smile. "You're not sick," she said. Julian's brow tightened slightly. "Then what is it?" The doctor held his gaze for a moment longer before answering. "You're pregnant." Silence. Complete. Absolute. Julian didn't move. Didn't react. Didn't even blink for a second longer than usual. The words landed, but didn't process. Not immediately. Not fully. Logan didn't speak either. Not at first. But something in his posture shifted, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. Julian turned his head slowly, looking at him like he was waiting for him to deny it, to correct it, to say something that would make it make sense. Logan didn't. The doctor excused herself quietly, leaving them alone in a space that suddenly felt too still, too narrow, too real. "You said that to get me back," Julian said finally, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something sharper beneath. His gaze locked onto Logan's. That wasn't supposed to actually happen. Logan held his gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. Not mockery, not arrogance, something softer. "Guess I'm more efficient than you expected," he said. Julian stared at him for a second longer before exhaling sharply, turning away. "This isn't funny." Logan stepped closer, not crowding him, just enough to be there. "I'm not laughing." Julian pressed his fingers briefly against his temple, like he was trying to reset something that refused to settle. "I didn't plan this," he said. Logan's voice softened, just slightly. "I know." Julian glanced at him again, irritation still there, but mixed with something else now, something harder to name. "You should have been more careful." Logan's expression didn't change. "You told me to make it happen." The reminder landed exactly where it was meant to. Julian went still for a second, then exhaled slowly, his frustration catching on something he couldn't quite argue with. "That doesn't mean immediately," he muttered. Logan reached out then, his hand settling lightly against Julian's arm, grounding, steady. "We'll figure it out," he said. And for the first time since the words had been spoken, something in Julian's expression shifted, not calm, not acceptance, but less resistant. The days that followed were anything but smooth. Julian's tolerance dropped fast, faster than either of them expected. Small things became irritating. Minor discomforts turned into sharp reactions. Logan didn't push back. Not once. "I want something sour," Julian said late one night, leaning against the couch, his tone edged with impatience. Logan was already moving. "Give me 10 minutes. 15 minutes later, he returned with exactly what Julian had asked for. Julian took one look at it, frowned, and shook his head. "Not this." Logan paused. "Then what?" Julian thought for a second, then said, "Something warm." Logan didn't sigh, didn't hesitate. He turned and went back to the kitchen. The staff watched quietly, exchanging subtle glances, but no one interfered. Because it wasn't frustration that filled the space. It was something else. Something steadier. Something that didn't break under pressure. Days turned into a rhythm. Logan adjusted everything without being asked. Meals. Schedule. The environment itself shifted to match what Julian needed before he said it out loud. And when Julian snapped, because he did, Logan didn't take it personally. He just adapted. "You're doing too much," Julian said one afternoon, watching him measure something carefully at the table. Logan glanced up briefly. "I'm preparing." Julian frowned slightly. "For what?" Logan's expression softened just slightly. "For what's coming." The answer didn't annoy him. Not as much as it should have. If anything, it settled something Julian hadn't realized was unsettled. By the end of the week, the changes were visible. Not just in Julian, but in the house. A room was cleared. Plans were drawn. Materials brought in. Logan worked with the staff, not above them, not directing from a distance, but alongside them. Measuring, adjusting, building. Julian stood in the doorway once, watching him, his expression unreadable as Logan focused on the structure in front of him, sleeves rolled up, attention precise. "You don't have to do that yourself," Julian said. Logan didn't look up. "I want to." The simplicity of it left no room for argument. The moment didn't last long. It didn't need to. The interruption came later. Unexpected, but not entirely surprising. The front door opened without warning, the sound sharp enough to break the calm that had settled into the house. Tyler Quinn stepped inside, his expression tight, controlled, but edged with something less restrained beneath. "You stopped answering," he said immediately, his gaze landing on Julian. "Messages. Calls." Julian didn't move from where he was, reclined slightly, one arm resting loosely as Logan sat beside him, hands steady, pressing lightly against his shoulders. Calm. Familiar. Tyler's gaze shifted between them, taking in the scene, the proximity, the ease, and something in his expression hardened. "So this is what you're doing now," he said, his tone sharper. Just letting him. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implication was already there. Logan didn't respond. He didn't even look at him. Julian did. Slowly. Deliberately. "You don't get to walk in here and talk like that," he said. Tyler let out a short breath, something between a laugh and disbelief. "I'm trying to understand what you see in." "Stop." The word cut cleanly through the room. Julian sat up now, his gaze sharp, no longer controlled, no longer neutral. "That's my fiancée," he said. Clear. Final. No hesitation. The words landed harder than anything else that had been said so far. Tyler went still, just for a second, but it was enough. Julian didn't look away. "And you're out of line," he added. The silence stretched. Then Tyler exhaled slowly, his expression tightening as he looked away briefly, recalibrating, but not backing down. "Not completely. You don't mean that," he said quietly. Julian didn't hesitate. "I do." Another pause. And then, the shift. Subtle, but immediate. Logan's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second before he leaned back slightly, his expression tightening, something faint crossing his features. Julian noticed instantly. "What is it?" Logan shook his head once, but the reaction was already there. "Nothing." A beat. Then, quieter, his scent. The words were enough. Julian's expression changed immediately. Sharper. Colder. "That's enough," he said, his voice controlled again, but no less firm. The staff moved before Tyler could respond. Not aggressively. Not forcefully. Just efficiently. Present. Clear. The boundary didn't need to be repeated. Tyler held his ground for a second longer, his gaze lingering on Julian, then Logan, before he turned and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him. And just like that, the house settled again. Not back to what it was before, but into something stronger. Something defined. Logan exhaled quietly, his hand returning to Julian's shoulder, slower this time. "You didn't have to say that," he said. Julian glanced at him, his expression steady. "I did." A pause. Then, softer. "So he understands." Logan held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once. And this time, neither of them looked toward the door. Peace, once it settled in, didn't arrive loudly. It unfolded in small, steady moments that made everything else feel distant, almost irrelevant. The house moved differently now, softer at the edges, warmer in ways that didn't need to be explained. Julian's mood still shifted without warning, his patience still thin at times, but the rhythm around him had adapted. Logan had adapted, and everything else followed. Until it didn't. The news traveled faster than expected. It always did. And when it reached the wrong people, or perhaps the right ones, depending on perspective. It didn't stay quiet for long. The front doors opened earlier than usual that morning, not with urgency, but with a kind of controlled force that carried expectation with it. Julian was halfway down the stairs when he saw them. His mother moved first, her expression bright, almost glowing as her eyes landed on him, taking him in with a mixture of relief and excitement that didn't try to hide itself. His father stood just behind her, posture straight, gaze sharp, already assessing before a word had been spoken. "You didn't think we wouldn't hear about this?" his father said, his voice calm, but edged. Julian didn't flinch. "I didn't think you'd come this quickly," he replied evenly. His mother stepped forward before anything else could be said, her hands immediately reaching for his, her smile softening. "You should have told us," she said gently. "This is good news." Julian didn't pull away, but his gaze shifted briefly toward his father, who hadn't moved. "It's not something I planned," Julian said. His mother's expression didn't falter. "Not everything needs to be planned." Behind her, his father exhaled slowly, his attention shifting, not to Julian, but to the space behind him. Logan stepped into view without hesitation, his posture relaxed, his presence steady, as if he had already decided he wasn't stepping back for this. The room stilled slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. Julian's father's gaze sharpened immediately. "This is him?" he asked. No greeting, no introduction, just judgment. Julian didn't hesitate. "Yes. A beat. This is the one I chose." The statement landed cleanly. Firm. His father's expression didn't change, but the tension in the room shifted instantly. "You chose him," he repeated, his tone tightening just slightly. "Out of everyone, this is what you decided was appropriate." Julian's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't ask for approval." His mother glanced between them, her expression still warm but now edged with concern. "Let's not start like this," she said quietly. But it was already starting. Julian's father stepped forward now, his attention fully on Logan, his voice controlled, but no longer neutral. "What do you do?" he asked. Logan met his gaze without hesitation. "I manage my own work." The answer didn't satisfy him. "That's not what I asked." Julian stepped in before Logan could respond again, his tone sharper now. "You're not interviewing him." His father didn't look at him. "I'm making sure my son hasn't made a mistake he can't undo." The words landed harder than intended. Julian's expression tightened immediately. "It's not a mistake." His father finally looked at him then, his gaze firm, unyielding. "You're carrying a child," he said, "and you chose someone who has nothing." The room went quiet. Logan didn't react outwardly. Not immediately, but something in his posture shifted, just slightly, just enough to register. Julian took a step forward, his voice colder now. "You don't know anything about him." "Then tell me." His father replied sharply. "What does he have? What does he bring to this?" The question hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. Logan exhaled slowly, then spoke, not defensive, not rushed, just clear. "I didn't have anything when I met him," he said. Julian's gaze flicked toward him briefly. Logan continued, his tone steady. "We had an arrangement. I stayed. He provided." His father's expression hardened further. "So you were being kept." The implication was direct, unfiltered. Julian's jaw tightened immediately. "Watch your tone." But Logan didn't react to it. He just nodded once. "At the time, yes." The honesty of it didn't diffuse the tension, it sharpened it. "And now?" his father asked, his tone cutting. Logan didn't hesitate. "Now I don't need that." A pause. Then, calmly, "The money I received, I didn't use." Julian's gaze snapped back to him, sharper now. Logan met it briefly before continuing. "I invested it." His father's expression didn't change. "In what?" "Gold. Stocks. Crypto," Logan replied. "Long-term positions." A beat. Then, without raising his voice, it grew. The room stilled again. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how simply they were delivered. "How much?" his father asked, quieter now. Logan named the number. No emphasis. No hesitation. Just fact. Silence followed. Complete. His father didn't respond immediately. His expression didn't shift, but something behind it recalibrated. Julian, however, turned fully toward Logan now, his eyes narrowing. "You had that?" he asked. Logan nodded once. "Yes." "And you didn't say anything?" Julian's tone sharpened immediately. Logan held his gaze calm. It wasn't relevant. Then, Julian let out a short breath, something between disbelief and irritation. "So what? You were just going to leave?" he said. "Wait until it was enough and disappear?" Logan's expression softened just slightly. No, Julian's gaze didn't soften. Then what? Logan stepped closer, not crowding him, just enough to close the distance. I was building something, he said quietly, so I could take care of what mattered. Julian held his gaze for a second longer, then frowned slightly. Then why were you working those jobs? He asked. Logan's lips curved faintly, just enough to register. I needed something to do, he said. A beat. And I needed to stop thinking about you. The honesty of it landed differently than everything else. Julian didn't respond immediately. He just held that for a second longer than necessary. Behind them, his mother smiled softly, her gaze shifting between them with quiet understanding. His father exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing, not gone, but no longer rigid. You should have said that first, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The moment didn't resolve instantly. It didn't need to, but the direction had changed. Subtly, irreversibly, the staff moved quietly in the background, but their presence became more visible now, not interfering, not inserting themselves, just supporting. Small comments, quiet confirmations, the kind that didn't sound rehearsed, but carried weight because they didn't need to try. He takes care of everything, the housekeeper said at one point, her tone respectful but firm. Not just for Mr. Julian. Another voice followed, softer but just as certain. He's always here. His father listened, not responding immediately, but not dismissing it either. And by the time the conversation settled, the sharp edges had dulled. Not completely, but enough. Julian stood beside Logan, not in front of him, not behind him, just there. Equal. Certain. And for the first time since they had walked in, his father didn't look at Logan like he didn't belong. He just nodded once, slow, deliberate. It wasn't approval. Not fully, but it was the beginning of it. And for now, that was enough. Happiness didn't arrive all at once. It settled in quietly, in the way the house felt warmer even before the sun fully rose, in the way footsteps echoed softer down the hall because everyone knew someone inside needed rest, and in the way Logan learned to wake up before Julian without ever setting an alarm. Just instinct, just habit, just care. The days that followed no longer felt like something fragile that could break at any second. They felt steady, grounded, like something built slowly but meant to last. Julian still had his moments, sharp words, impatient sighs, the kind that used to push people away, but now they didn't land the same, because Logan never took them as rejection, only as something to hold gently until it passed. You're staring again, Julian muttered one morning, not opening his eyes as he lay on the couch, one arm resting loosely over his stomach. Logan didn't deny it. I'm making sure you're real, he replied, his tone light, but his gaze soft. Julian huffed quietly, shifting slightly. You're annoying. I know. And yet he didn't move away. Outside, the world continued as usual, but inside, everything had changed. The staff moved around them with ease now, no longer cautious, no longer uncertain. Their quiet smiles no longer hidden when Logan carried a tray of food into the living room or when Julian, without thinking, reached out and caught Logan's sleeve to stop him from walking away too soon. It was in those small moments that everything felt settled. The nursery had slowly come together, piece by piece, not rushed, not forced, each detail considered, each corner softened with intention. Logan had insisted on building part of it himself, not because he had to, but because he wanted something in that room to carry his touch, something real, something permanent. It's crooked, Julian commented one afternoon, watching him adjust the small wooden crib. Logan glanced at it, then at him. It's character, he corrected. Julian rolled his eyes, but didn't argue further. Later, when Logan stepped away, Julian reached out quietly and ran his fingers along the edge of the wood, just once, just enough to feel it. The house, once too large and too quiet, now held something different, something alive even before the child arrived. And when the day finally came for the ceremony, it didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like a natural next step, something that had already been decided long before anyone spoke it out loud. The venue was simple, private, nothing extravagant, just enough to hold the people who mattered. Julian stood still as the final details were adjusted, his expression calm but unreadable, the usual sharpness softened just slightly. His mother stood nearby, her hands lightly resting against his arm, her smile warm, proud. You're still allowed to look nervous, she teased gently. Julian didn't react immediately. Then, after a brief pause, I'm not nervous. But he didn't pull away either. Across the room, Logan adjusted his cuffs, his movements slower than usual, more deliberate, his composure steady but not untouched. This wasn't something he took lightly, not something he treated like just another step. This was everything. When their eyes met across the space, neither of them looked away. Not this time. Not anymore. The ceremony itself was quiet, almost understated, but it didn't need anything more. The words spoken were simple, clear, without embellishment, but they carried weight because they didn't need to prove anything. Julian listened without interruption, his gaze fixed, unwavering, and when it was his turn, he didn't hesitate. "I chose you," he said, his voice calm, steady, the same certainty that had carried them through everything. Logan didn't smile widely, didn't react dramatically, but something in his expression shifted, something deeper, something that stayed. "And I'm not changing that." Logan nodded once, his voice low but firm when he answered, "I'm not going anywhere." The moment didn't need applause, didn't need noise. It settled in the same way everything else had, quietly, completely. By the time the evening softened into something more relaxed, the tension of the past felt distant, almost unreal. Julian sat slightly apart for a moment, one hand resting over his stomach again, not out of habit this time, but awareness. Logan approached without a word, offering him a glass of water instead of anything stronger, his attention automatic, consistent. Julian accepted it without comment. A beat passed. Then, quietly, "You didn't have to stay," Julian said, not looking at him. Logan didn't hesitate. "I wanted to." Julian's fingers tightened slightly around the glass. "You still do." Logan's answer came just as easily. More than before. Julian exhaled slowly, something in his shoulders easing, something that had been held for too long finally settling. "Good," he murmured, almost under his breath. Later, as the guests began to leave, as the house gradually returned to its quieter state, the warmth didn't disappear with them. It remained, woven into everything they had built together. Logan walked beside Julian as they moved back inside, their pace unhurried, their silence comfortable. At the top of the stairs, Julian paused, turning slightly toward him, his expression softer than it had ever been. "Don't mess this up," he said, the words still carrying that familiar edge, but lacking any real threat. Logan's lips curved just slightly. "I won't." Julian studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once, satisfied, before continuing forward. And when Logan reached out, not to stop him, not to pull him back, but just to let his hand rest briefly against Julian's, Julian didn't pull away. He never did anymore. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, in the stillness of a home that no longer felt empty, in the presence of something new and something certain, everything finally settled into place. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but real, steady, and enough to last.